I was sitting in her office and I was like, Mary, I don't think I can do this anymore. This is so frustrating. I just don't fit into this organization. I don't have the same style. And she just paused and she looked at me and she said, Chris, that's why I hired you.
Hello and welcome to the Virtually Anything Goes podcast. This episode is part of our Leadership Stories series, where we speak to leaders from a variety of different backgrounds, including AI, healthcare, software, strategy, executive coaching, and others. And if you like what you hear in this episode, be sure to subscribe and check out our other episodes too. Today, I'm talking to Chris Knerr about his leadership story, how he got to where he is today, and whether any obstacles threaten to derail his journey. Chris is the VP Technology Strategy MedTech at Veeva Systems. He's responsible for helping MedTech CIO and IT leadership customers maximize the value of their digital transformation strategy. Chris has worked in an advisory role with executive teams of Fortune 500 and Global 2000 companies. He was the Chief Digital Officer at Synity, and before that started and exited his own business, as well as spending 14 years at Johnson & Johnson, where he, amongst others, held the position of VP Enterprise Supply Chain Business System Strategy. If that wasn't enough, Chris holds an MBA with distinction from Cornell Johnson Graduate School of Management and was class valedictorian. And I also understand that you started a second degree recently, a master's degree at University of Pennsylvania, focused on history and philosophy of science and technology with a focus on artificial intelligence. Chris Knerr, very warm welcome to you. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks, Webb. Great to be here.
Excellent. If this is your first time listening or watching the Virtually Anything Goes podcast, stick around until the very end when I turn control over to Chris, and he can ask me his Virtually Anything Goes question. This question can be any question at all. I won't know what it is until Chris asks me, so it could literally be about anything. The only caveat is that Chris will have to answer the same question after I have given my answer as well. So Chris, judging by the introduction and your career to date, you have all the traits of a high-achieving leader. But one thing I didn't mention was that you also studied philosophy and still consider yourself a philosopher. I know also that you have 10,000 books at home, and all of that points towards you being an academic thinker. Was philosophy a passion that could have led you down a different path entirely, or did you always know early on that leadership was something you aspired to?
So when I was in undergraduate at Columbia, my original intention was to become an academic philosopher, and that didn't work out for a variety of reasons. It has an interesting leadership component. I think part of what led me down a different path was that all the role models that I had, who were not the older professors, but the sort of younger ones, didn't seem very happy in their work, and that was, I guess, a bit discouraging, and led me down a different path into an initial venture into entrepreneurship, and then eventually into business school and into a business career. But I found philosophy to be an excellent background for any kind of work, and something, as you mentioned, that I have quite a lot of interest in and still read and write about today.
Excellent. I'm sure we'll dive into that in a bit more detail as we go through our conversation as well. But maybe give us a little bit of an insight to start with. What was the school-aged Chris Knerr like? Was he a leader from the very beginning, or was it more about living life in the moment?
Well, maybe both to a certain extent. I had an interesting and kind of complicated childhood. I'd like to say that or I guess my observation is I've always had an effect on people, whether to the good or to the bad. As a kid, I was kind of an outsider to a certain extent. My parents split up when I was very young, and this was when this wasn't terribly common. So, among other things, I was the kid who liked to read a lot, the weird kid who had divorced parents. So there was, I think, an interesting texture to my childhood in that way, that some of these traits, persisted into adulthood and to some extent into my business career and my style as a leader, which we can talk about.
Well, I'd love to dive into that, actually. Back in 2001, you started your career as an intern at Johnson & Johnson. 14 years later, you leave the company as vice president. What job, I mean, generally speaking, what job or role taught you most about people before you ever even had to lead them?
So, kind of going back to the beginning of my story at J&J, in a way, I think like a lot of successful people do, I had quite good luck falling into a kind of work that I turned out to be good at, and there was kind of a burning need for it, which was project management and eventually program management. I think from a transitional standpoint, everyone who graduates into leadership eventually has to make a key transition between doing work where you know everything about it and know all the details and are completely conversant, to doing work where you're managing other people and the scope of the work is beyond your capacity to understand all the details of the work that you're leading. So I had a progressive series of roles doing, kind of process re-engineering, testing management for systems implementation before finally graduating into, running bigger projects and programs for myself. And it was kind of those transitional jobs where I had to personally make the transition from, being very detail oriented, very analytically, knowing everything about the work that I was doing, to leading and managing other people. At the time, I was like the young guy too. So I was leading people who were, some cases, 10, 20 years older than I was, who had much more experience. So there's both a level of abstraction transition and then kind of a confidence transition in terms of one's own perceived credibility to manage people who know a lot more than you do, and kind of become comfortable with that. This is something that I often talk to emerging leaders about these days, and of course, I suppose now I come across as being very confident. I'm often reminding myself, and in coaching people, reminding them, like, when this happened to me, I was so terrified. I was very uncomfortable. I had no idea what to do, and it's interesting. You can kind of see there are people who can't make that transition, and those people will tend to become, sort of stabilize at some level, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But those early roles where I was transitioning to taking on more scope and then managing people who were older and had much more experience than I did, were very foundational to, I think, kind of the first stage of my development as a leader, as a business leader in particular.
Yeah. I mean, I'm intrigued. I mean, what was there a moment in your professional career or in your personal life where you recall having a conversation that changed that trajectory of your career? And if there was, what do you recall of such a conversation?
Certainly. I mean, there are a number of key conversations, and I could give you a couple of examples. And I always find this interesting to think about, in retrospect, like what were sort of the key moments, and these are examples of good leadership that you can emulate as well. So one was, I was very fortunate at Johnson & Johnson to have a series of amazing managers. And J&J, I'd say overall, has got a very, very strong general management culture and genuinely values people and leadership and people development. And, interestingly, on a side note, in the industry that I work in now, there are a tremendous number of J&J alumni who are CEOs of MedTech companies. Right. And you sort of wonder why that is. Well, they got that training. So I had one of the first kind of marquee program that I was leading at J&J involved a tremendous amount of change management, difficult change management that was sort of good for the organization, but no one really wanted to do it. In reality, that's of course, the nature of change management. And I got so frustrated, over a period of months and, probably years. And I had a conversation with one of my most wonderful managers and leaders, who's named Mary Turso. And the conversation went, I was kind of on the fence, like I was almost going to give up. And I was sitting in her office and I was like, Mary, I don't think I can do this anymore. This is so frustrating. I just don't fit into this organization. I don't have the same style. And she just paused and she looked at me and she said, Chris, that's why I hired you. Right. So this kind of goes back to where we started the conversation, a bit of an outsider, disruptor, personalities. That was it was just one little sentence she said, and I knew her very well, of course, by this point, and I really respected her, and I was like, okay, I get it, and I probably really wasn't going to give up, but it was nice that I could, again, if you think about leadership characteristics to emulate, it was nice that I knew her well enough to be able to be open and just kind of be like, I don't know if I can take this anymore. It's awful. And then her response was, so thoughtful, and also kind of gave me confidence and support to continue. Another one, I won't say who this was because I found him to be a rather dislikable person, but a good executive leader. He gave me, maybe one of the top few pieces of career advice I ever had, which is like, he's like, you're too serious, lighten up. So this was in an even bigger program later on, and the feedback was, it's like you come and like just get right into, like what's the agenda, what are the objectives, and you're making everybody anxious. At this point, I was dealing with very senior people. He's like, so just be a little bit less serious. It's fine. Like talk about football, talk about the weather. Just start out like break the ice in these conversations, and it was a good insight because I was so outcome driven, especially in, those mega programs that I was doing later that were very, very complicated, very high risk, that I was sort of perhaps lost sight of how I was showing up. So, the lighten up advice was another very good piece of advice. And interestingly, it came from someone, as I said, I found I didn't ever perceive him to be a particularly good leader, and he was, I think, a rather abrasive character overall. But you want to take this advice as it comes to you and take it seriously. Of course, he's someone who'd been very successful too. So my personal point of view about him was in a way neither here nor there.
Yeah, but I suppose both of those came from different angles, or perhaps different motivations. I'm not sure, but certainly, I think it's interesting. I've had several conversations with different leaders for this series, and one thing that you mentioned, which seems to come up time and time again, is the importance of the leaders that you reported to or that you worked with earlier on in your career, and the effect that had on your own career progression. And that seems to be the case here as well. If I understand the kind of the stories correctly, it helped you to really, I guess, one, be validated, but also continue on the path and accelerate along that path.
So, yeah, certainly. And I mean, this is another thing where I think that there's a huge amount of luck involved. So some organizations do this very well. J&J, there are a lot of people who are terrific leaders. But whether you can find kind of the right mentors at a particular moment in your career, to some extent you can seek those out, and I highly recommend that everybody do that. I get my personal experience, and I don't want to over-index on this. I don't know if this is true universally. I think I've found it more difficult as I've grown in my career to find those mentors at a senior level. I still have other leaders, other executives who I worked for at J&J who are still mentors, and they might be some of the best mentors that I have even now. So the other thing is they're long-term relationships that you can form, and there are actually quite a number of people who used to work for me at J&J who I still help and kind of serve as a mentor to them. But I definitely think that's a good observation, that who you end up getting earlier in your career there are these kind of transition moments, as I mentioned, as you get sort of more scope in terms of work, more scope in terms of people management. These aren't things that, in my view, necessarily come naturally. One may have characteristics that sort of lend themselves to being good at it or not. But there's a huge situational aspect of it as well. So I definitely agree with that observation.
Yeah. I mean, you may have sort of alluded to it already, but who is or was perhaps a role model of yours? And you talked about emulating characteristics. Who is or was a role model of yours? And do you feel you've emulated their approach to leadership, or did you develop something else, your own style based on that role model? Can you think of anybody that comes to mind there?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's, Mary, who I mentioned before, is a very good example, and I think temperamentally, one of the things I learned from her was empathy, as a leader. And again, as I mentioned, I've always been ambitious. I'm very outcome focused, and I think by personality, earlier on, I tended more. There's a thing in these self-evaluations you can do, right? And it's kind of a typical question is like, do you see people or do you see problems? Right. And earlier on, I was definitely like the guy who saw problems, and people were sort of incidental to it. So, something Mary was so good from an empathy and a people leadership standpoint, that that was something that I really picked up on when we worked together, and when I worked for her. So, I think if one's fortunate to have a number of different role models over the course of a career, you can kind of pick up different things from them. And to a certain extent, whatever leadership is, it's not something that I view as being generic at all, right? Like, so, it's very much about individuals, organizations, individual leaders, and their characteristics. I had, I think, other role models earlier on who I think sort of encouraged that outcome focused and accountability behavior. Maybe that was something that came like a little bit more naturally to me. I do view that as a hugely important characteristic, especially if you're working in companies, and especially in large companies where accountability tends to be diffused. And part of how you can get things done is by doing, sort of an unpopular thing, which is actually holding people accountable to what they've notionally agreed to do. I think there were other senior executives that I worked with at J&J who, kind of taught me a lot about, as I got more senior, about the part of this that I consider more difficult is the political part, right? So far we, mainly what we've talked about, you might call like managing, leading down, right? Like leading up, influencing laterally, influencing senior management that often has, a lot going on and possibly competing priorities, is a very difficult thing as well. So I had other senior executives who I worked for at J&J, and afterwards as well, from whom I learned a lot about how do you, when you don't have any authority, how do you create influence in order to get the outcomes that you're striving for. In my view, that part's a lot more difficult. In my experience, that part is a lot more difficult, and there's a lot more that you can't really control in it.
Yeah. Do you think it's more difficult based on how you are as a person and what you described earlier, or do you think it's generally just harder because there's more unknowns and there's more moving parts to it?
I think it's inherently more difficult. I mean, I'll give you, if I may, and this is sort of philosophical, I'll give you a kind of a pessimistic observation, which is that senior leadership, and like perhaps let's talk about politics, maybe more than business, to avoid casting any aspersions. So political leadership clearly has what economists call an adverse selection problem, right? Adverse selection is when you have a pool where negative traits are encouraged, right? So, what you find in politics, in my view, and to some extent what you find in large organizations is that you end up with a lot of people in senior leadership positions who are very political. And what that's an example of the adverse selection. So what does that mean? Like in practical terms, it means that they're more interested in themselves than they are in the outcomes that they're trying to drive. And so, earlier on, I think I had this very naive view of the world of being quite meritocratic. And of course, it's and my observation, sort of empirically over the course of my career, is the more you get promoted, the less meritocratic it is on balance, right? And of course, these are like big generalizations. So, but I think that's a worthwhile thing to think about. And I don't think I got until like much later in life, when people talk about work or business being political, what that really means. And it literally means the same thing when if you look at any government, or political party system, and you talk about them being political, like what does that mean? It means connotatively that a lot of their actions are driven by self-interest. Right. And so, I think that as you rise in many organizations, what you find is that the mix of, let's say, visionaries to survivors becomes less favorable. So, in my view, it's inherently a more difficult matrix. The more that you are dealing with very senior people, the more you're dealing with their kind of competing incentive structures. And by the way, this is an empirical observation to a certain extent, not a value judgment. Everyone does what they need to do in order to survive in their career. I think the really good executive leaders who I was fortunate to work for, I also worked for some who were not great, and we don't necessarily need to get into that in any specifics. I think the characteristic of senior leaders to me that's most important is the willingness to make decisions that may not be good for them and may not turn out well. Right. And again, you sort of think it's an interesting mental model of the world. If you work with senior people, you kind of look at them and you can, of course it's more complicated than this, but you can say, is this person a visionary or is this person a survivor? Right. And those let's think of those as archetypes. And of course, real life is more complicated, but those archetypes act in quite different ways. And to me, what I would aspire to be is the archetype of the visionary, who's willing to do things that are unpopular and willing to do things at personal risk that may not turn out well.
Would you say the visionary is sort of outwardly focused in terms of decision making, and the survivor is more internally focused for themselves in terms of decision making?
Yeah. I mean, so this sort of gets to like why are you taking the actions that you're taking? Is it for good reasons or not? And again, I want to be careful. I'm not suggesting that self-interest is inherently negative. It's not. I think that there's a lot of the world and a lot of companies and competition that functions by self-interest. If you over-index on self-interest, my view, that's unhealthy, right? And then what you end up with is things that are highly politicized. And again, without getting into a whole political conversation, I think anyone with any different view can kind of look at the state of many countries and see this exemplified very clearly. And I think, it's the insight that I had after a long time, and it's one of those things, like, at least once I thought of it, it seemed quite obvious to me that, I never really internalized what it meant for things to be, quote, political in business. And it's like the same as it is in politics.
Yeah. And that's interesting. I mean, you touched on the fact that leadership isn't always easy. I'm wondering, is there a decision or an example of a decision that you've had to make that wasn't easy, one perhaps that kept you up at night, and I suppose interested to hear whether you would make that same decision again today, with where you are today?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll give you an example, and then I'll want to come back and say something else about this as well. So, in this is sort of back to my first major program leadership role at J&J, and the a large transformation effort, and for a variety of reasons, we really fell behind. We fell behind schedule, and there wasn't going to be any more money. So I asked everyone to stay after school. Basically, I asked everybody to stay late on Tuesday night and Thursday night until 9:00 for 2 years. I didn't know at the time. I wasn't like, "Hey, we're going to do this for 2 years." At the time, I was like, we need to do this. And we brought in dinner, and it was a complicated decision because, of course, it's like everyone's got a life, everybody's got a family. On the other hand, sort of looking at the bigger picture, if we failed in what we were trying to do, it would have been bad for everyone. The other part of this is I stayed all those nights, unless I was traveling. So I was, I kind of made sure, as the leader of this and the person who had requested it, I didn't want to do anything. I didn't want to ask the team to do anything I wasn't willing to sign up for myself. So, and it turned out to be a really cool thing in terms of, the team building and the team dynamic. And you could also, interestingly, like, get a sense of, it's like, who's going to stay for Mexican takeout and flee right afterwards at like 7:15?
Mm-hmm.
Who's going to actually stick around until 9 as requested and do their work? But I was asking a lot of people too, right? That's a lot to ask of people who are already working hard. And also, when I made the request, it was open-ended, and it did turn out to be for 2 years that we did that. And we did catch up, and we didn't have to ask for any more money, and we delivered a good result. And I think everyone was very proud of what we'd done at the end. The thing I was going to say about this is, talking to leaders and talking to entrepreneurs, I think generally, everyone who's successful, in my view, tends to understate the role of luck and things turning out in their favor that they can't really control. Mm-hmm. So I almost think of these, just you could draw kind of a 2x2 consulting matrix, right? That goes like, was the decision a good decision or a bad decision inherently? And did the decision turn out well, or did it not turn out well? And one of the things, kind of going back to what we just talked about, being willing to take on some risks. Part of the willingness to take on risks is taking actions that may not turn out well, that have a lot of things in them that you can't control. So I'm sure, like, anyone you interview is going to have a good answer to that, right? Like, did you do something smart and it worked out well? And in a way, a more interesting question is, did you do something smart and it backfired? And would you do the same thing again? And if you're kind of living into that, accountability as a leader and doing things for the right reason, there should be things that you've done that backfired, that maybe you wish you could rewrite them, but of course you can't. So these things sort of tie together, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
There's for anyone who's interested, this is sort of a deep cut, but there are two essays that are often called the vocation lectures by Max Weber, who's one of the founders of modern sociology. That one's called Politics as a Vocation and one is called Science as a Vocation. And a big theme, I happened to reread both of these after quite a few years for my work at UPenn. One of the things that Weber really emphasizes about leadership is how difficult the decisions can be, and that good leaders are willing to accept unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. It's I think, that topic in itself, or everything we just spoke about in this last section, is something that we could probably unpack for much longer.
Yeah, indeed. There's a lot to it. But maybe if there's a key insight in this, as anyone who's talking to people about leadership or success, I find this to be particularly true of entrepreneurs, by the way. Like if you because I was an entrepreneur, as you mentioned, actually multiple times, and all other entrepreneurs are going to give you, most of them will give you this story as if they did everything right, and tell you why you should do what they did because they did everything right. Now, in fact, if you look at empirical, there's some very interesting work that's been done in Silicon Valley on startups and key success factors, and essentially what all the empirical studies are, longitudinally across a big range of startups have found is that the key factor is timing, right? And timing, so to me, that's sort of like luck, and did the things that you can't control go in a favorable way? And there are also very interesting examples. One of the things I wrote about recently in one of my classes at UPenn is you sort of think about technologies that were great, but the market wasn't quite ready. And a very famous example is the Palm Pilot, right? Which was, the original, what they called PDA, personal digital assistant, in the late 90s, 2000s. And it was a kind of a good technology product, but it wasn't quite the smartphone. But it's sort of, I wonder, would there really have been smartphones? One, the way that they ended up being designed and going to market, and two, would they have been so successful if the groundwork hadn't been laid by the Palm Pilot and the BlackBerry, right, which is sort of an early version of that. So you can kind of see these cycles. So there's, like the Palm Pilot was an excellent product. It wasn't a blockbuster product, really, not the way that the iPhone was. And there are a number of factors to that, but I think if you look at history of technology and then you look at sort of what people are telling you about their endeavors, I think thoughtful people will try to articulate why they had good luck as well as good execution.
Yeah. I mean, I can speak from our own experience. We obviously, I started Made to See, back then it was Web and Experts, in 2016. And for several years it went very well. We grew and things were going well, and then COVID hit, and as a company that helps other companies run webinars, the timing couldn't have been any better. Now COVID was horrendous, obviously, and many people affected, but from a business perspective, it helped us grow even further and support our customers when they needed it, and we were well placed. But that, I certainly didn't plan COVID, and I didn't plan for anything like that to happen. But the timing was fortunate from a growth perspective for us. So I completely relate to what you're saying there.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and there's a lot of in enterprise software, right? There was like this big dip, and then there was this big peak, right? Almost like the supply chain disruption. So everything, so much macroeconomic uncertainty, everything went on hold. Right. And then everything came like roaring back at the end of 2020 and 2021. And certainly we saw Synity is a data services and software company in the ERP market primarily. So we saw that, very clearly, that like a lot of headwinds, of course, when the pandemic happened, but then a huge bounce back from that. Interestingly, this is sort of a major footnote for anyone who's interested. If you look back at the history of major companies, you will find that there's a correlation between certain kinds of innovation and macroeconomic crises. And of course, the reason for that is that a crisis forces you to innovate. The example that you just gave is a very good example of that, right? So, it was often said in 2020, 2021 that we achieved, 5-10 years of digitization in 2 years. And that was forced by the circumstances, right? Everybody had to figure out how to work remotely. So then, what happened? Your business zoomed, right? That was, really, really like a rocket fuel for Zoom, and a number of other associated businesses like that. So, good entrepreneurs will also, this is sort of the converse of this point about luck, will also see a crisis as an opportunity, what thing doesn't work anymore, and what's the new innovation, or what's the new product market that I can bring to a changed market, in order to create some innovation in it.
Yeah.
But I think this is all quite interesting.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's fascinating to think and talk about, and there'll be, many examples, I think, where that plays out. I'm sure there's books written about it already, and perhaps some of those are part of your 10,000 book collection as well, but I'm sure there'll be plenty more written about them as we go forward, especially during this time as well, and probably over the next sort of 5-10 years of the innovation that's happening, and perhaps some crises that come from that as well. But I mean, we touched on sort of several stages, I suppose, of your journey, and we spoke about the COVID, and you mentioned Synity there, and I'm just wondering, do you think your leadership style has changed over time? Did you start out in a certain way when you first were in leadership, and do you think it's different now, and to what extent has it changed, if it did?
Definitely has changed. Well, I mean, so one thing is that, I spent a long time leading very large organizations, right? So, I mean, my extended team when I left J&J, including all the matrix teams and all the contractors, was like 1,200 people. So it was, let's say larger than most American companies. So quite large. And then I had my startup. And I had co-founders in that, of course, and that was, the maximum size of that was close to 100 people. So, much smaller. And most of the roles that I've had since then have been as kind of, like senior leadership, but individual contributor. So Synity, I had no organization. Veeva, I have no organization. I work for the president of Veeva MedTech, and I work with a lot of our executives. And so I do leadership, but it's sort of more diffuse in a way than when you're actually leading a large organization. I think we touched in terms of my my evolution as a leader. I kind of touched on two components that I think are interesting and important already. One is being more empathetic to humans. It kind of in a balance with making sure that drive accountability, achieve the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, but bring people along with you. And then I think the other one is the political part of it, right? So I had a conversation with so I also teach sometimes for the past few years guest lectures at the graduate school at Cornell. I got to do one on AI last year at UPenn as well. So I really like working with MBA and graduate students. And so there's a thing like all the old people will go back to the business schools and they'll be like, the most important class you're going to take is organizational behavior, right? Because that's all about, kind of how to do this. But the thing that I realized is that like a lot of that, I'm not sure it can really be taught. Like you can read about these stories of senior people and, how they succeed or how they fail and all their trials and tribulations. But the political and the alignment and like how to influence people, to some extent, I think you have to learn that by experience, both positive and negative experience. So that, really understanding, kind of how to navigate that. And I guess the other thing that maybe this is particularly evident to me in my current role is that I'm kind of always thinking about, when I work with CIOs and other senior leaders, in large MedTech organizations, like what do they really care about? Because what people say they care about isn't always what they actually care about. And maybe a final observation on this is, and this is a very business specific observation. I think maintaining a really keen financial focus is critical, right? So and if when I did my MBA, I did a lot of finance coursework. Like my background in a way is pretty similar to if I'd gone into investment banking, because I felt that was very important in terms of being able to become a senior leader in business, which was always my aspiration. And I think that was a really good decision. Interestingly, I think that this financial focus often gets diluted in people's minds. So, I have a this actually partly came out of J&J, but also subsequent experience. Like what do companies really care about, right? Growth, having an efficient cost structure, and what I generally call quality, which can also mean differentiation in the market. Right. And I now, like, the more I do this and the more I think about it, I sometimes say, like, people say a lot of words and paragraphs about what they want to do. I think if you decode them in business context, generally what you find is that they're always talking about one of those three things, right? They want more growth. They want a more efficient cost structure. They want, in life sciences, quality and compliance is obviously particularly important, but generally you can kind of think about, differentiation. How do you compete? And that all adds up to how do you compete in the marketplace, and win in the marketplace. And of course, there are other aspects too, like we would like to have people have a good working experience. So there's sort of, the team thing. But I'm often coaching people that, if you want to invest in a certain area, this is perhaps another pessimistic observation, but I think it's a true one. Like you're not going to get investment by telling the people who are making the investment that the team is going to be happy with the investment, right? Yeah. They want the team to be happy, but really what they want is to make some money. Right. And it's like, again, this is like perhaps this seems like childishly simple, but again, I've been working in this area in particular of, transformation, digital transformation, and it's expensive and it requires lots of investment dollars and lots of change management. And then, like, how do you motivate people to do this? So, in an interesting way, this sort of like later phase of my career where I don't have an organization right now, maybe I will again in the future, to be determined. Really focusing on incentives and why. And again, this is sort of evolutionary. Like, of course, I knew this all along in a way, but this is something that's really, maybe sort of the third major component. If you're especially when you're leading up and leading laterally, understand, like, what is people's motivation? What do they want? This can be at the organizational level or it can be at the individual level.
No, that's it reminds me of something, and I think what you're alluding to there as well, it's not necessarily always financial incentive. People are motivated by different things. Of course, we need to all pay the mortgage. But I saw an advert. Somebody shared it with me the other day, and I don't remember the company's name, but it was like a sort of marine engineering company, I think, and it was a talent and recruitment type advert, and it showed various different situations. If you want to sit in the middle of the North Atlantic, lashing with rain, freezing cold, join us. If you want to dive, 100 meters down, stay there for 3 hours and weld something, join us. And it was basically for 99% of people, probably more than that. The scenarios that were being laid out in this advert were entirely unappealing, but it appealed to the people that this company wanted to recruit, that thrived on the adversity and wanted to find solutions for things that would be difficult. I thought that
you'll have to send me that, Webb, in case the in case the Veeva thing eventually doesn't work out. I'm listening to this. I'm like, that sounds cool. Sign me up. Yeah, I used to be really into years ago into metalworking and welding. So, but I never did underwater welding.
It's a highly paid job, I believe, but it's also very risky.
It sounds compelling. I think just to pick up on your point, right? So this, like growth, cost efficiency, quality, differentiation, like these are things that businesses care about, and they're helpful in terms of making a case for transformation and making a case for change management. And when I say helpful, maybe essential is a better word, right? Like I don't really think you're not going to really get investment to do things unless you can kind of explain. And I know this is a very American sounding thing. I've been saying it more and more. Show me the money, right? And you go to senior people and they're very, very, very polished, but you do want to show them the money. The political thing about individuals, to your point, is like, can I pay the mortgage? And you sort of worry about, think about how people respond in terms of, this is kind of, again, back to a mental model that's useful. Like, who is the person? Are they a survivor? Are they a visionary? And again, I'm really not placing a value judgment on this particularly. It's a useful thing to be able to understand in decoding people's behavior.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it like that. But I mean, throughout this conversation, we touched on humans, as part of this overall equation, a part of leadership, and I suppose leadership itself is inherently human. I remember reading an article. I have to kind of refer to my notes. I remember reading an article that you wrote for Forbes, and you described the effect algorithms have on human choice and preference, and how these are truncated by algorithms that users can't control. I'll say that again because it's something that I think is important to take in. It's the effect algorithms have on human choice and preference, and how these are truncated by algorithms that users can't control. And you had an example about entering a lift in a hotel, and you wrote this article in 2021. And since then, we've seen a steep increase in AI. And obviously, you mentioned this, UPenn, the work that you're doing there as well in machine learning. Do you have the same criticism of AI systems that human decision making or choice is reduced through implementing those?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that this has been there for a while to see, and the specific story that motivated this is I was in a hotel, and the elevators had an optimization algorithm, so it would route the elevators most efficiently. So I was chatting with someone waiting for the elevator, and it put us on two separate elevators to optimize an outcome, which is, getting the person to their floor most quickly. And so then the question, and in machine learning speak, right? Like, what's the objective function? Like, what is it that you're trying to optimize? So, I would have rather talked to the guy. I would have rather, and again, it seemed like a powerful metaphor because one's always talking about the elevator conversation, right? The elevator pitch. It's like, what do you say to somebody in 60 seconds in the elevator? And I was already, chatting with him. So I thought that was sort of an interesting metaphor, not that it's like wrong to optimize travel time in elevators, but are you necessarily optimizing the right thing? And all of these, this goes back to this behavioral economics idea of nudges, right? Where you're opt in versus opt out. And so I hugely still have this same concern. And if you know a bit about the way machine learning and algorithms work, and by the way, this is the same thing applies to large language models in a slightly more complicated way. They're optimizing for outcomes that are statistically typical, right? So and famously, right, and I think you're aware, and most of the audience is probably aware. AI is not very good at what's called the long tail. Like, it's not very good at corner cases. Humans can be pretty good at corner cases, right? So, the concern, maybe put broadly, is if you have algorithms that are enforcing statistically common outcomes, and you insert those into a choice architecture that relates to humans, you're actually abrogating human choice and human autonomy in that. And I was concerned about it in 2020, 2021. The software company that I had was machine learning and sort of early AI. So I know a fair amount kind of under the hood about how these systems and how these algorithms work. I think that we should all be hugely concerned about this. And in fact, I'm more concerned about this than I am about, sort of the Skynet rogue AI. Because what do these algorithms do? Like, in effect, they're codified bureaucratic rules. And you can see this, you can see the effect of these nudges and how these have been institutionalized. It's like the way, like every website, right? It's like they're always opting you into something and you have to say no to it. And one, it's a waste of time. And two, it's just this constant land grab for your attention and to get you to kind of behave in default ways statistically, which is, to me, like not the good part of being a human, That's not the part I like about being a human. I like the part where you get to choose stuff and you get to think about stuff and, be thoughtful. So, yeah, I hadn't thought about that article for a while. And I think it was called, ironically, I Was Optimized,
Right.
right? And of course, the point is that it was like, it was actually a stupid thing that happened. It's really, well, the irony of this too is they had this in a hotel, and the hotel had like 6 floors. So it's like, who cares? Yeah. Like, I get that. I've stayed in like the Times Square Marriott, which is like 60 stories and has like 23 elevators or something. So yeah, like you have kind of a more complicated traffic routing problem there.
Mm. Yeah.
In this situation, like, why?
Yeah. No, 6 floors is it's not worth probably, but
It's not. No, and I don't know. Maybe that guy would have invested in my company.
you'll never know.
I'll never know, because I was optimized out of the possibility of having that conversation.
I mean, it is interesting to think about that and the impact it has, and especially because a lot of it happens without us probably even being aware. I mean, you didn't know that that's how you clearly did know that how the elevators work, but if I'd walked in there, I probably wouldn't have been none the wiser myself, and I think it'll be the same for many other people.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and like the elevator, like, maybe it doesn't seem particularly important, but let's think about how, like, so these algorithms are going to be. Let's talk a little bit about my industry, right? It's like, you look at the evolution of healthcare, like, evidently these algorithms, to some extent, already are, and in the future will be used more for care decisions, right? Like, think about it. It's not going to be very surprising if there's, in some markets, right, there's going to be care rationing, and it's going to be driven by algorithms. Like, that to me seems pretty bad.
Mm.
Like that, or so if we're providing decision support and it's useful, great. But like, let's not let it become this invisible thing. Like, we don't want decision support to be invisible the way electricity is invisible.
Right.
Compute is now invisible, right? Like, it's a commodity. Like, you go to AWS and you turn some stuff on, you pay the money, and it's a utility. I think it's honestly a very concerning aspect of our human future if that kind of decision support and optimization becomes invisible in the sense of a utility. And, there are lots of areas in which, and I think I pick the, care apportionment or care adjudication as a particularly consequential one. I think we should be, concerned about that and make sure that we understand, and that there, has the, I don't really love the name, but sort of, human in the loop idea, but essentially make sure. I'm more concerned about creeping bureaucratization than I am about Skynet rogue AI, personally, because it's more, it seems very, and of course it's along the lines of optimization that, is very, optimization's a good thing, right? I like to optimize things too. I like to optimize them in a way that we retain control, and that again, this is very important, right? And anyone could sort of read about what this means. Like, when you program algorithms, or when you set up neural nets, like, you're defining what's called an objective function.
Mm.
That's the thing you're trying to get to. So, maintain control of, like, what are the correct objective functions, and are we creating, kind of a monster of bureaucratized, codified decision support that's invisible, that's going to govern healthcare decisions, insurance reimbursement decisions, employment decisions, actually HR. This is a very interesting example too. Like, what advice do I give people on their resumes these days? I'm like, keyword optimize it, because, the first set of screening is done by algorithms.
Mm.
I mean, are these algorithms like really that good? And remember, we're talking about humans here. We're not talking about like hex nuts or something, where you can machine scan them and be like, this one's good, this one's not good. You're talking about humans. And we basically, in the HR world and the talent world, we've already created that bureaucratized nightmare. If you talk to people, college students, graduate students, about their experience trying to get jobs in the job market, it is a horrible experience. Why is it a horrible experience? It's for exactly the same thing that I was writing, reason that I was writing about in 2021. It's been fully outsourced to algorithms for decision support for the first few tiers of the process. Like, personally, I think that's terrible.
Yeah.
So yeah, kind of a long-winded answer, and obviously I have some energy on this topic, but it was a concern 5 years ago, and I think it's an even bigger concern. And again, maybe if there was a key insight that I could distill, like, I think you phrased it very well, that the concern is about human choice and human autonomy being abrogated by algorithms, and that's much more the case than it was 5 years ago. And the trend is that will continue to be the case going forward. And I think that's hugely something for us to pay attention to.
Yeah.
As citizens, as leaders, as business people, especially people working in these areas.
Yeah. I mean, obviously ChatGPT was the one of the starting points for the masses to understand and interact with AI, but AI is obviously under the hood in so many more places and has for so much longer. Let me bring this back to, I guess, AI and leadership together, because we've spoken about both. If we look at the impact of AI and how individuals use it within the business, particularly whether the organization knows it or not, how teams use it, how entire organizations use AI, I suppose we could extend it to the entire markets. Will AI, do you think, make leadership, or the role of leadership, easier, or do you think it'll make it harder? And is because I mean, we spoke about the interpersonal interaction and your mentors and the leaders that you worked with. Is AI going to ruin that, or is leadership entirely independent from AI?
It's an interesting question. Maybe I'll try to answer this in a couple of different components. So one is, let's look at this through the lens of history. And I had a colleague who talked for us at one of the Veeva conferences, who had a great phrase: AI is not a fad. So it's a real technological transformation of world historical consequence. So in that sense, anything that's that big a change poses inherent leadership challenges and inherent leadership opportunities. And maybe if you were to go back and think about things that rhymed, so in like right before I went to B school, the internet was like a thing, but it wasn't clear what it was going to be. I graduated from Cornell in 2002, right after the dot-com crash. So I've observed, the feeling that I have about AI is kind of like the feeling that I had in the late 90s about the internet. Like, it was clearly big. It was clearly not going to go away. It wasn't really clear to anyone what it was yet, other than that it was going to be hugely consequential. And you could decompose that into, I think it's highly likely we're going to see changes in the labor market, right? Certainly in developed economies. And those macroeconomic changes, again, those inherently pose both leadership challenges and leadership opportunities. So just in terms of, what business leaders are dealing with in terms of change, yes, I think that, it creates new challenges and new opportunities that are kind of structurally inherent to any kind of a technological revolution, which evidently, large language models and what's happened with AI generally is counts as that in my view. So that's sort of one dimension. There's another dimension maybe that's a little bit more subtle. So going back, like, if we end up in a world where algorithms and AI largely mediate performance reviews of humans, that seems bad to me, very much along the lines that we just talked about. It's kind of another example of where I think that would be bad and will sort of tend to dumb down. And, saying that provocatively on purpose, like, that'll dumb down the process, right? The process will be worse. It'll tend to, I think, diminish the positive effects of the human aspect of this, which is a lot of what we emphasize and a lot of what, I found important to me personally, and hopefully what people I work with who are emerging leaders like about talking to me, right? Or find valuable about, about me as a mentor, sort of somewhat later in my career. So I do think, that's a concern. I think, maybe the third thing that poses a challenge is, that I worry about, and this is a little bit more specific to large language models in particular. I think there's a valid concern that over time, those are going to dilute aggregate critical thinking skills, right? So, and again, imagine, it's like this is sort of people talk about this example, right? It's like, well, we still teach people how to do arithmetic, right? But, so how to do it and how it works. But then, I go to multiply, most 2-digit numbers together and I use a calculator. I use a calculator on my phone, right? And that's not particularly significant. When you're getting into things that are kind of higher up the stack, if you will, in terms of importance and the kind of work that humans have traditionally done. I mean, I'm already seeing examples where people are sending me stuff that was obviously written by, Chat GPT or one of the other engines, and it's not very good. And so, I do worry that laziness and habituation are going to creep into critical thinking skills. And I think in consequential business role, I mean, business is very complex, right? Like there are a lot of moving pieces to it. And, again, kind of going back to like, what do I like about philosophy? How have I kind of applied that throughout my career? Critical thinking is a huge part of it. Like understanding a lot of the things that we've talked about, like why are people doing what they're doing? What are the assumptions? Like how can you optimize things? What's the analysis? If we over-index on outsourcing too much of that to the next generation of widgets, which are large language models, that strikes me as being likely detrimental to critical thinking skills going forward, and that's going to pose a huge challenge. And I think maybe I'll if I can take a philosophical detour for a moment. One of the papers that I wrote for UPenn, I was sort of exploring deep fakes, right, and images in particular. Mm-hmm. And of course, like this is sort of another element of perhaps not so much related to leadership, but you care if an image is fake. Right? It's like, that's the thing. The thing about an image, if it's fake, is that it's fake. It's not real. So there's sort of both in what philosophers would call an epistemological impact of this, which is how we acquire knowledge, and an ontological aspect of it, which is what kinds of things exist. So I'm going to come back to the critical thinking thing in a moment. But if you consider, a world we may live in 5 years, is that our thought process around every image that we see in the media is going to be, is it real or is it fake? That's a huge change. Again, philosophical terms, epistemologically, in other words, how we know what we know, right? And ontologically, kinds of things exist. That's huge, right? So that's not how I grew up, right? Basically, like you knew there was trick photography, but basically, like if you saw images, the images are in effect real. Yeah. The same thing develops for all kinds of intellectual products that were typically produced by humans, right? Like I was saying, someone sent me something, I'm basically like, this is poor, right? It was obviously written by a chatbot, and then it's like, you have to send it back. And then it's sort of this whole calculation of, am I going to be like, dude, don't send me chatbot crap. I didn't ask if I was allowed to swear. I've been very well behaved so far. Don't send me chatbot stuff, right? Or do you just sort of coach and be like, hey, these are the things I think you should think about when you're trying to work on this problem. So, the analogy of in 5 years, we probably are going to change our relationship to all images and wonder if all of them are fake. In 5 years, we're going to probably change our relationship to all work products and wonder how much human is in them. And then of course, like I use I use the chatbots myself in kind of certain targeted ways, but I try to use them in a way that's very focused on things that I already know about, where I can kind of sanity check and I'm going to be able to detect if errors are creeping in.
Hmm.
Maybe they're going to get better, but just the way that they work, they are just statistical still, in my view.
Yeah.
So that remains to be seen. So yeah, I mean, I think that if I sort of go back, I gave you three different answers in three different dimensions to this question about, does AI make leadership more complex? Absolutely. I think it does. I think it also, again, I try to avoid binary answers to things. So like it makes it more complex, but in a sense, it also makes it more important, right? And in particular, the human aspects of it that we've been talking about today,
Yeah.
right? So let's not, as leaders, let's not lose that part of it, because that part of it is very important.
I think that's we're not finished yet, but I think it's a great point to end on. I have so many more questions, but I think we are starting to run out of time, because we do also still have the virtually anything goes question. Before we get to that, first of all, obviously, Chris, some really interesting conversations here and really interesting answers to questions I thought might be straightforward, but actually I think you've nicely showed actually there are nuances to it, and it's important to consider those and keep those in mind as we go forward, because it's not necessarily binary, as you said.
The problem with talking to philosophers, right? You get complicated answers to things, because of course part of it is always like, well, what's behind the question? But I find all this very, very interesting.
Absolutely, I totally agree, and I appreciate and think it's great that you answered in the way you did, because it makes everything more considered and interesting. But we get to a point where we now have the virtually anything goes question. If it's your first time listening to this podcast or watching it, this is where I turn control over to Chris. He can ask me any question he wants. I've been badgering him with questions for the last hour or so, but you can ask me any question you want. I don't know what the question is. I do have to answer it no matter what it is, but my safety net is that once I've given my answer, then Chris, you need to also answer the same question. So I'll hand the reins over to you. Please take control.
Okay, so I love this, by the way. This is a great premise for a podcast too. So we've been talking about artificial intelligence, and we talked a little bit about so-called artificial general intelligence. Can machines think the way that you and I think, in the sense of being self-conscious agents?
I think there's a lot that's talked about in terms of the being sentient and whether AI is aware of itself. And I think to a degree, I mean, I'm no AI expert, but from what I know and understand and think, there's an element to that. But I think humans are inherently flawed, aren't they? We are not perfect. We will never be perfect, and to a degree, we don't want to be perfect. I suppose depending on who you are, but I know that being perfect probably wouldn't be what I would aspire to. I want to be human, and to be human is becoming a philosopher now myself, I guess. But to be human is to be flawed and to be quirky and have different areas of interest. And I suppose unless there's some kind of chaos theory that can be programmed into the AI models or can be learned by it, although there's no rhyme to that chaos, then I don't think they can be like humans, or be as self-aware that it would emulate. And I suppose back to your point, it's the kind of statistically most expected outcome is what AI currently answers or provides, and that may well get better. But I just don't think that, as flawed as we are as humans, that an AI would be able to emulate that. That's my opinion, anyway.
That's an excellent answer, and I very much agree with that. And I think you hit on. So I answer the question now.
Sure, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think that we have any algorithms or machines that are self-conscious and can think in the same way that humans do. And I think you hit on a key aspect of it. And let's take a brief detour into the famous Turing test. But what's interesting about the Turing test is it's about fooling you. right? So the Turing test is it's about, can you create this is my translation of it, and this will probably cause a lot of arguments, and we can get into the arguments, but it's really about, can you create a convincing simulation? But in my view, a convincing simulation doesn't mean that the underlying thing is the same. Also, I think you hit on a very key point, which is that, the AI systems that we have now, I mean, one, they're just statistical engines. So they're basically very big, very complicated nonlinear distance functions with different kinds of architectural layers in them that create convincing dialogue outputs in particular. So certainly they passed the original Turing test, but I don't see any evidence that they have feelings, right? And of course, this goes back to a philosophical point. There's a huge tradition in the West of what I would call rationality bias, going back to the ancient Greeks. So we like to talk about, it's like, what's special about humans? Humans are rational. I don't really agree with that as stated. I think I've met humans, as I like to say, and they're not rational. They're capable, they're not, right? I mean, they're capable of rationality. So, what exists in a human, and I think this is sort of interesting for the whole leadership conversation, it's a mixture of humanness, or what you were saying, our flawed nature, our emotions, and the ability to be rational. The ability to be rational, which is different than, quote, being rational. And I don't see any evidence so far that any system is exhibiting those traits. And again, if you ask the question in a different way, it's like you talk to Claude or you talk to Chat GPT, like, does it care about the conversation? Like, if you phrase the question that way, I think most people will be like, no, it doesn't care. But yeah, if you ask if it's intelligent, generally people answer that they think that it is intelligent. And so I think that, to me, our the beauty of being human, exactly as you said, is in part in our imperfect nature, and in this, this interesting mix of emotion and rationality, and our relationship to other humans who are the same as us. There's maybe one more observation I'd offer on this, and this is, I'm still thinking about this, and perhaps the audience can look forward to my publishing something on this at some point. If we were to say that, the Turing test is a good test in terms of output, right? So it's measuring the ability to simulate. But if we don't think that that's satisfactory in terms of whether, quote, something is really intelligent, I don't rule out, by the way, that it's possible. I don't claim it's impossible. I claim that, we're in my view, there's no evidence that we're there yet. If we get there, I think it'll be very difficult to tell. Right. It's going to be kind of a deep mystery, because of course, like, what what you're judging on is also the outputs, right? So when people respond to this and they're like, the Turing test is not a bad test, it's totally aligned with cognitive neuroscience, and like, there are lots of things, and I do understand that argument. I think it'll be very, very difficult to tell. And kind of how I think about this is there's a thing in philosophy and cognitive neuroscience called the hard problem of consciousness, which is sort of explaining consciousness itself in humans. In fact, no one's really been able to agree on this in several thousand years of our, best, wisest, smartest people thinking about it. I don't know if we think we should be able to agree on it with respect to machines. I think there's actually what I call the harder problem of consciousness, which is if you have consciousness that's non-human. This could, by the way, also be animal consciousness, which is a very interesting field, or machine consciousness. Like, how do you know? If there's a hard problem just related to humans, I think when you get outside of humans, it's what I call the harder problem of consciousness. So even though my hypothesis, or my strong hypothesis, is that we don't have this now, and there's no evidence of it, if at one point it arrives, I think it's going to be very unclear how to decide if it's real or not.
Yeah, no, I can see that, and especially if it happens over time and perhaps not with a big bang, then it will probably just creep and seep in, won't it? It's absolutely fascinating, and I could talk much longer about all of this because I think it's fascinating. Maybe I should have studied philosophy as well, and maybe you've set me off on something there. But looking at the way, pardon.
It's never too late.
Never too late. No, indeed, it is not. As you've mentioned with doing another degree now while you're still working as well. So, Chris, absolutely fascinating, and I really appreciate your time in talking to us and giving your insights, giving your opinions, and your views on leadership, of course, and everything that surrounds it. And I think I've learned today that there is a lot more around it than perhaps I previously thought or knew. Thank you very much for being here and sharing that. And of course, thank you to our audience as well. We always love having you with us. If you liked what you heard just towards the end, especially in the Virtually Anything Goes question, we have a great episode with Ben Field, who's the CEO of Fusion Films. It's the company behind Virtually Parkinson, the late talk show host, where they created an AI version of Sir Michael Parkinson, who interviews humans. Very fascinating, related to much of what we spoke here about today as well. But in the meantime, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with somebody else who you think would be interested as well. And until next time, we'll see you in another episode. Take care.